So twice you've referenced consciousness in regards to machines, and I think for a lot of people this seems like something akin to magic or something that doesn't seem real, but that you could talk about using words, but to really say what would it mean for a machine to be conscious. But what do you mean when you say that?
Now this is actually the very center of my research. So I may go a little deeper here than usual. My own view is, there's various views on this, needless to say, from those who, the classic Cartesian dualism, which is the root in some ways of modern thinking about consciousness, which I believe and most current researchers in consciousness believe is wrong. But anyway, Rene Descartes believed that consciousness and the body were two separate materials, and that they talk to each other through the pineal gland of all weird things, and that you could think of consciousness as being analogous to the Christian soul, and that when you died, the consciousness separated from the body, went and did its own thing, etc. I would say modern thinkers, mostly, at least scientific thinkers, reject that view, and they believe in consciousness as being emergent from the material. So consciousness emerges from our brains and our bodies, and when the body dies, the consciousness dies, and it does not go on in some separate existence. It's not a separate material, so it's a uniformitarian view. Then there's a second fork, which those who believe that consciousness, I believe it's called functionalism, that if you had a computer that was similar enough to the way humans process, or even process it in a different way, you could nonetheless create an identical consciousness experience to that which a human has. I would say that I'm skeptical of that, and the school that I approach this question from is the school of John Searle, the Berkeley philosopher, who writes some amazingly accessible books, by the way. If you want to read a philosopher's take on the science of consciousness, look up John Searle. That's Searle. His view is that our consciousness, the only one that we know of, call it the animal consciousness, emerges from our bodies in a very complex way. It includes the brain, but it includes the gut, and it includes our skin, it includes our senses, everything else. And so attempting to duplicate our exact consciousness in a machine is going to be very, very difficult and probably won't happen anytime soon. However, he describes consciousness as a biological function like digestion or respiration, which has many components to it. Like, you can't put your finger on something in your brain and say, this is consciousness. Rather, it's a dance of lots of different things in the body and the mind. And just like in food science and in pharmaceuticals, we have things called digesters. They use bacteria, they use fungi, they use yeast to process raw chemicals and turn them into higher value products. And we call it a digester, even though that digester doesn't look anything like your colon and your stomach and your pancreas and your liver, but it does something analogous. It's kind of like digestion. So there's a long way around. So where I come out is that things like my conscious deer, very rudimentary, but and other machine consciousnesses that we're likely to see in the next 5 to 20 years are going to be analogous to what human consciousness is, but in no means closely identical to it. I know that's a whole series of pretty fine distinctions, but they're important when you think about this question.
Well, I remember when we were about to do your podcast, we had kind of talked a little bit about consciousness, and I had mentioned the daemon, right? The inner voice that's behind people. And you were kind of like, well, there's some philosophers out there that say the decisions that you make are not actually driven by you. In fact, we can watch in an MRI that you make the decision, and then you're conscious. Well, then you become conscious of the fact that you made that decision. So something is going on behind the works, and just because you perceive that you had the choice doesn't mean that you actually did. Is that a fair representation of that?
Yes, that's called the Libet result, one of the most famous studies in cognitive science, that it appears that the decision, for instance, to move your finger happens somewhere on the order of half a second before you actually move your finger. And one variant on that is, okay, what is free will, right? And one variant is that the decision to move your finger is part of the unconscious machinery of the mind. And what the conscious layer has is a very short window to veto that suggestion. So it happens, and you have a very short period where you can say, no, don't do it. And that's essentially what it means. The fact that the neurons are starting to fire to move your finger before you're conscious of it, but typically you're conscious of it before the finger actually moves. So you have a veto window, and maybe that's all free will is. And the other important thing about consciousness, particularly, and this is where I work very closely and where my simulations are digging in, is that consciousness orchestrates and is a workspace for the integration of unconscious processes. The vast preponderance of our processing is unconscious, but signals from the unconscious are constantly rolling into the brain at a relatively slow rate, which is quite interesting. And then the processing occurs very slowly, relatively speaking, to the unconscious in the conscious brain. It's the dance between the two, which makes animals who we are. And I should point that out, that the school of thought that I'm involved with believes that animals from at least reptiles up are conscious. So consciousness is not just a human artifact. It's been something that's been evolving probably since amphibians, and certainly, our dogs are conscious, birds are conscious, reptiles are conscious. And so when we talk about consciousness in this biological Cyrillian sense, it's actually much more productive to consider all these creatures are conscious. It gives us a lot more to work with rather than just our own introspection. What makes our consciousness seem different and indeed be much more powerful, at least the Cyrillian view, is that we have a new class of conscious contents, meaning symbols, language, that we can manipulate and that we can store in our memories and we can do cool things with. And so that makes our consciousness be able to do lots of things that, let's say, our dog can't do. On the other hand, our dog can do a lot of things that we can't do. Like a dog, in theory, can diagnose somebody who has cancer based on their smell. We don't have a brain that processes smell in the same way a dog does. And so in that domain, the dog's consciousness is more powerful than ours. But on the other hand, a dog can't write Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and at least the occasional human can. And that comes from the ability to manipulate symbols.
Well, in your conversation with Yosha Bach, I remember laughing out loud and then actually stopping and taking what you were saying very seriously, which is, if you look at the contents or the size of a brain, right, of an elephant or of a whale, they're massively larger than a human being's. And Yosha said, well, maybe they all became autistic because they realized that consciousness in and of itself, or the ability to work yourself into this symbolic world where you end up in offices and need to do drugs to do all these things. Maybe they decided to shut down some of this consciousness in a different way, which I thought at first I kind of laughed at, and then thought, well, actually, that's maybe a rather serious observation.
Yeah, Yosha is an amazing out-of-the-box thinker. And I think and I never had that thought, right? And very few people have the kind of thoughts that Yosha has. On the other hand, there's not an iota of evidence for that. I'm pretty firm on the idea that within our evolutionary tree, i.e. those things that are we all use a uniform DNA encoding. It's very clear that all life that we know of on Earth is all descendant from a single root. And so within that evolutionary tree, I believe humans are the only ones that have clearly passed over the line to have high-powered use of symbols. Can't prove it, but it would seem there's no sign at all that any other animal has come even close to the human level of symbol usage that we have. And if someone were just barely over the line, let's say the equivalent of a proto-human, say 300,000 years ago, it's not at all clear they would have the capability, the technology, or the inclination to be able to back away from that. That it's taken 300,000 years to evolve a being like Yosha in the human line that could have that radical thought. So I very much doubt that's true of the elephant and the whale, but I can't prove it.
Thanks for checking out this podcast short. If you like this interview, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button and hit that bell so you always get notified about this podcast. And if you're really interested in conversations like this, you may want to consider joining the Articulate Ventures Network. To find out more, go to network.articulate.ventures.